Hello and welcome to On the Table. I'm Rachel and I'm here with Rebecca and Corie, and today on the table we are going to be discussing the topic of justice, specifically God's justice. But before we dive into that, we always start with a question. So today's question is, if a movie was made of your life, who would play you?
Such a good question.
It's a tough question
It
for
is.
me, really, but
There's
we'll go
so
ahead with
many
it.
people out there to choose from, you know.
There's so many talented actors.
So many that look just like me. No, if I had to pick one, it would probably be Shannon Purser right now,
Okay.
which, disclaimer, I've never actually seen her in an interview or anything like that. I've only seen her in Stranger Things and then like one or two other shows. And she just plays characters who are similar enough to my personality that I'm like, you would do me justice. You would be fine. I would hire you. Yeah, she's also got the red hair-ish,
Yeah, she does.
Yeah.
which works.
Yeah.
Hers is more red than mine, but we could work with that.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Freckles.
That's okay.
She's just got the quirky kind of personality that would work fine.
Okay.
So that'd probably be my first choice. She's also pretty tall, which is good.
That's
Yeah.
helpful.
So,
That's good.
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
nice to have a general, like them, if they look close to the person
Yeah,
that they're
close
playing. If
enough.
you're playing a real person, it's kind
Exactly.
of. But they do so much now with
Yeah.
hair and makeup that
Yeah,
they can
it does a
almost
lot.
make
Anyone can be anyone, yeah.
anyone can look like anyone.
It's
So
true.
It's very true.
So you really could pick anyone who doesn't even look like you if you really wanted to.
Yes, you
It's
could.
true.
So, do you have any
I was
thoughts?
totally stuck with this because I am not good with actors and actresses or anything like that. But Rebecca was mentioning Rachel Weisz.
Yes.
And what I haven't seen a lot of her work, but everything that I have seen of her, she normally plays more like nerdy analyst,
Yes.
obsessed with history,
Corie.
journalistic
Yeah.
characters
Yes.
that I resonate with. So I think that makes
I
a lot
think
of
she
sense.
could do you justice.
She's one of the ones that when my husband and I are watching a movie and she's in it, we're like, oh, Corie.
Good to
She's
know.
on the screen.
Just
What about
with
you?
Okay, so this is kind of tough, and I had my first answer, but then you had a different suggestion,
sort of
which I'm gonna
discussed.
yeah, no, I'm changing my answer. I would pick Keira Knightley,
She's good.
and the reason is I love her in like I love a lot of her characters. She does such a good job, but she always ends up playing my favorite romantic
does.
love
She
story
does
type
it
characters.
so
She does
well.
it so well,
does.
and I just feel like that would be who I would be like, please play me. Oh, crap, the mic. Please play me.
Yeah.
So
I also feel like
That's what I
she's
would
one of
choose.
those people too that like since Pride and Prejudice, since that movie, I have typecast her. Like she can
Yes,
only play
she's
love
Elizabeth
stories.
Bennett.
She is forever
that's-
Elizabeth Bennett for me anyway.
But she does but she was also in Pirates, and she did such a good job
Yes.
doing
Yes.
that. Like, because it's a love story, you've got that love component, but
Yeah.
it's also like
Yeah.
this actiony adventure, and she
Yeah.
kicks butt there too. So
She does.
Yeah.
So
That's
I feel like
true.
she's very well rounded.
Yeah.
Good.
So
It's good.
totally do it all.
That would work.
Yeah,
She could work
totally.
for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice.
Okay. So on to justice. Now.
Yes.
I guess we'll just dive in.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, is there, or what is the standard for justice? Is there a standard that we should look to? And we're specifically talking about God's justice. So, is God just? There's a lot of
Yeah.
debate, and right now in our culture, you're seeing a lot with like social justice is coming up a
Yes.
lot, and that kind of thing. So, is God just?
Yeah, and I think this is an issue that really is difficult within our culture because, you know, Christians would say to our society that our society does not have a foundation for justice apart from God,
Right.
which flies in the face of everything that you see in these social justice movements and in the West right now, because the West has this idea that there is morality, so if there's morality, then there's justice, so
Yeah.
there's something that's right and there's something that's wrong, but the problem is they believe that morality and justice is all a social construct. It depends.
Yes.
You make it up yourself. So
Yes.
whatever you feel is right, then that's right.
And like
Yeah.
your truth is your truth, my truth
Yes.
is my truth. Very much that kind of
Yeah.
idea.
So how then can you how can you wage war? How can you tell another culture, you know, murdering women and children is wrong, genocide is wrong? How can you say that
Yeah.
if in their culture, to them, they feel it's not wrong? So they have this relativistic morality. And so in our society, we feel like there's justice and we want there to be justice,
Yeah.
but there doesn't appear to be a logical or reasonable backbone for justice in
Yeah.
our society, even though
Yeah.
it feels like there should be.
Yeah.
So then the Christian, then we're like, okay, well, all of our culture was built upon Christianity in the West,
Yep.
and in the Bible we see that God, an occurring line throughout the Old Testament is God loves justice and mercy.
Yes.
So that's something
Yes.
that we would attribute to God, a reason,
Yes.
a backbone for morality, right?
Right.
Just kind of
It's one of
setting
his
the
core
stage.
attributes, kind
Yeah.
of. Yeah.
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 So that is a claim of the scriptures, and that is a claim of Christianity, that God is just, and from him we derive all of our moral truths and
Yes.
things
Yep.
of that nature,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And to say too that like with other cultures and even Western culture, we've gotten so far away from the Bible, which does
Yeah.
give us a really great outline of justice, that it is now, I think, especially difficult to say this is justice, this isn't justice, because like what you said, there's no backbone for it anymore if you're not getting it from the Bible.
And so many people would say, well, the Bible is old and it's
And
antiquated.
it's unjust.
And it's
Yeah.
so unjust. And then a lot of times you'll ask them, well, have you actually read it? Well, no, I've Googled certain things and I've read verses here and there. Well,
they kind of pick
okay,
and choose their
that's
verses.
great, but
Yeah.
if you're going to give something a fair trial, if you're going to say absolutely it's just or absolutely it's not just, then you need to know what it actually says.
Yeah.
This is true.
Right?
You can't just take it out of
can't-
context
yeah.
and take a verse here or there, or extreme situations or
Yeah.
or things like that.
Okay,
yeah.
let's do that, because the next question that I have is, does God's justice ever go too far? And I have a couple examples. In the Old Testament, we hear about the destruction of the Canaanites in Joshua and Judges.
Yes.
And then we also, if you want to jump to the book of Acts chapter 5, there's the story of Ananias and Sapphira.
Yes.
And so you've got two different examples of God's justice, both of which end in death of people.
Yes.
So
Yes.
does God's justice go too far? Can we say that God is just if he's okay with eliminating an entire people group like the
Yeah.
Canaanites?
Right.
Or this couple who lied to the Holy Spirit? Can we still say God is just?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to. I think we have to get into the mindset biblically and get into the mindset in our own personal life that our sense of justice and what we know as justice isn't necessarily justice.
Right.
And for us to say, oh, like, even though this is a core attribute that God claims to have and says in his word we has, for us to be like, no, that's not justice, I would say rather than to say that that's not true, we would have to change our view of justice based on him rather than him change his view of justice based on us. It makes no
Right.
sense if you were to do it that way, right? So I would say, from the Bible, absolutely God's just. He is perfect justice. And in fact, he often in situation shows mercy where justice could have been given.
Right.
And a really good example is King David. King David should have been given the death penalty for adultery because that was common in Israelite times. It was in the Levitical law. It's all in there, but he's not. And he's given mercy. And you see that time and time and time and time again.
Right.
So I think that often, even in the Bible, justice can be a case-by-case situation.
Yeah.
And Jesus shows us as well with the adulterating woman when he's like, if you've sinned, you can throw the first stone.
Yeah.
And it's almost like he changes the perception of justice there, not to say
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
the old laws are gone, but God gives wiggle room there
Yeah.
as well. But he also shows you that, there is still consequences for what you do.
Yeah.
You can't go by the exception of the rule. You still have to go by the rule, but know that, God does grant exceptions to that, which I think is interesting.
Well, and that also, like, that mercy, those exceptions are in Joshua and Judges. And everyone always, like, even scholars, they'll throw around words like cultural genocide and things like this when it refers to Joshua. And it's like they've never actually read Deuteronomy,
yes.
Joshua, and Judges.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
so there were some cases in Deuteronomy 25, for example, when God's dealing with the Amalekites who have already had interaction with the Israelites, where God says, wipe their memory out. Like, they're gone.
They're done.
And they had an interaction with Israel, and it was a very negative one, and that is the reasoning for that. But even when they were going in to take over the land of Canaan, they were not commanded to wipe out everyone and hunt down the Canaanites who left. Any Canaanites who left, they didn't chase them down.
Yeah.
Right.
And even the very first city, they spare Rahab and her entire family for the actions of Rahab, one woman
Yes.
who decided that she was going to side with Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so she sides with Israel, and her whole family is saved out of Jericho, and the rest of the inhabitants of Jericho are wiped out. And also, Old Testament historians and archaeologists, there's a really puzzling thing that a lot of people aren't aware about in Joshua, where you see the Israelites take over cities without a battle, and you see them not killing the inhabitants of the city.
Yes.
So, for example, the city of Shechem. Now, Shechem is a city that is between two mountains. The name Shechem means shoulder, basically, of the mountains. And there's two mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And in Deuteronomy, Moses commanded the Israelites, by God's direction, that when they went into the Promised Land, they were going to march to Shechem, go up on the mountain, and renew the covenant with God, pronouncing curses and blessings for obeying the covenant and cursings to not, and then the people would agree to those. So this was like their contract with God.
Right.
And so that was the command. And so you see in Joshua, after the Battle of Jericho and after the Battle of Ai, Joshua leads the army and all of the people of Israel right into the heart, like Shechem's in the center
Yes.
of the land of Canaan, and they're not fighting anyone. And they get to Shechem, and historically and archaeologically, we know that Shechem, the king of Shechem, controlled the whole central hill country of what became Israel, what was Canaan. And there seems to have been some sort of agreement between Joshua and the king of Shechem, because not only there's no fighting mentioned that happens, they come in peacefully. They're allowed to go up on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, but if you read the text carefully, it talks about Shechemites being there listening to the curses and blessings. So clearly the story of Joshua isn't justice without mercy. It's not genocide. You can't call it that. People call it that often.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to polarize things, I think.
Yeah.
But so I would say that, like, the story is not as simple as people would like it to be, and you do see mercy, and you do see not everyone being wiped out in the book of Joshua, and then later on in Judges, which kind of becomes a little bit of a problem. But and then also, so we should talk about this whole Ananias and Sapphira thing, because I categorize these as two different things. So in Joshua and Judges, you're dealing with the group of Israelites who are God's people dealing with outsiders.
Yeah.
But now here in the New Testament, you're dealing with insiders. People who are in the church.
Yeah.
So
It is different.
this too far? Did God go too far with Ananias and Sapphira? Because he kills them. They lie to the Holy Spirit in Acts, and then they die.
drop dead.
Well, and like, it's Paul, right? In this,
Peter.
It's Peter.
It's
Sorry,
Peter.
Peter.
It's Peter.
And, like, he gives them a chance
He does.
to
He
tell the
asks
truth
them-
here. Like,
he
he
asks
gives them
them,
a second chance.
And they lie.
Yeah, and they lie again. So, like, no, I definitely don't think it's too far. I think very much so. That's God enforcing the rules they have already been told. Give it another chance. Again, that's mercy.
Yeah.
He didn't have to ask them again.
Yeah.
And then following through. And I think that's very much something that if that's what God says is justice, we should just accept that for sure.
It's kind of a tough question. It's not a tough question to answer, but it's worded, and I worded it that way intentionally. But it's like, I feel like you can't ever really say God's justice would go too far, because if God is sovereign over all,
He's like the measure of
He
justice.
is the measure of justice.
I
So
mean, like,
you can't, like, how
Yeah.
would he go too far? We are his creation. We
Right.
can't, like.
Right.
This
we're
is kind of
subject
more of a matter. It's like, do you agree with God's justice?
Yeah.
Not, do you like it?
That's
Does,
the other
does God's
question.
justice
No,
offend
not
you?
always.
Yeah,
because,
sometimes it offends me. Yeah,
because you're on the, if you're on the receiving side of discipline, it's not always fun. But God disciplines those He loves. So there is that too.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think you can say that God, because God's mercy is so extreme. Like when you're talking, like, I think people like to look sometimes, especially critics will look at all of the evil things that seem to happen in Scripture, all these bad things that happen, and they want to blame God, even if God didn't have a hand in somebody else's actions.
Yeah.
But we have to be really careful with that. And God's mercy was so extreme that he sent Christ.
Yeah.
And Christ paid the penalty for our sins. So his mercy is so extreme on the flip side that you kind of have to bear that in mind as well.
Yeah.
Well, and like even the big picture of life, God's mercy is so extreme. Like the wages of sin is death. So the fact that we are not all dead after having sinned once is in itself a mercy. Right? So even the whole picture of God, like yes, there's this whole side of justice, but without that side of justice, you're not going to have his whole side of mercy, which is so much greater because of his justice, right?
Yeah.
And it's all tied to love. Like you know, if you're going to look at justice and mercy and God according to the premise of the Bible, the other premise is that God's love is so big for us that he created us and he loves each individual so intensely and equal as the next individual.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so so I think like that there's a lot to unpack with that concept of love, but his mercy flows from his love and his justice flows from his love as well. He ultimately he wants what's best for every single human, and I believe that because humans have free will, sometimes he is essentially forced, if you want to use that word, to make certain decisions that he may not be super happy about making, but he makes them.
And it's like a parent. Like it's such a cool analogy to have it on earth and to be able to see, you know, parents with their kids. They tell them something, they reinforce it. And you know, if you don't reinforce it, that bad habit or that bad thing they're doing is going to continue.
Yeah, you
and
have
God's
to
very
discipline.
much the same way. Like look at Israel. Israel's a great example. They do the same thing over and over and over and over, and God reprimands them over and over and over and over, and they just keep doing it. And like it ends up to the point where God's so frustrated with it that he puts them in exile, and it's so many things over and over. It's such a repeating pattern, but it's so much like parents with their children.
They take it so far so many times.
Yeah, but there's like after not listening so many times, eventually you have to be like, okay, this is the rule. You have to enforce that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the pattern in the Old Testament. They turn away.
Exactly.
God sends a judge.
Exactly.
They come back. They turn away.
Exactly.
God sends a judge.
And like
Yeah.
over and over. It's like every book of the Bible has that in it, right?
It does,
So
that element.
yeah.
For sure.
I think it's interesting.
Okay. How about this one? How is biblical justice different than today's system of justice?
I would say it's very different.
Yes, I would agree.
Very, very different. And I think even our concept and even our definition of justice is different than what in biblical time it was. So like today, if I was to steal your pen, okay, and say that was a crime, then I take your pen, I use your pen, I break your pen. You don't, I get caught, okay? You will never get that pen back. I'm not going to give you money for your pen. I'm not going to give your pen plus whatever was owed, like what it was in the Old Testament. You are never going to get justice.
Yes, you've stolen
Instead,
my
I'm going to
little bit
jail.
pen.
You're going to pay for me to go to jail, and I will stay in jail comfortably being fed, and that is what we say is justice. But really, biblically, that's not what it was. If I stole something from you or if I killed something of yours, it was about the victim rather than the person who committed the crime.
Right.
And in today's laws,
There's restoration.
there's restoration. Today, we don't get that all the time.
Yeah.
You know, instead you fight with the insurance company about your pen and you're going to get into all kinds of laws for that. You have to pay for insurance to begin with. And like over and over again, it's not about the person, the person who's been stolen from, it's the person who steals. And we create stupid systems that God never had in place for that. But that's not God's view of justice or restoration. We don't have that anymore in our system in the way that it is. So when people are like, oh, that's so unjust, most of me agrees with them because I'm like, biblically, you're right, because you haven't been restored in what's happened to you.
Yeah.
Right?
And even the law, like even the Mosaic law was not perfect in that,
No,
like,
not
what
at all.
good is it if you kill my mom for me to kill you? Like,
Exactly.
that's great, and that's the whole eye for an eye, and that was the law
Yes.
for the Israelites. It was meant to, what I believe is it was meant to highlight the seriousness of sin.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that concept of that equal sacrifice either
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
if you steal something, I have to give it back to you plus more.
Exactly.
That whole concept, it's
Exactly.
highlighting the seriousness of sin, and it's to dissuade anyone from doing it. If you know that's what the penalty is, most people are probably not going to do
It's
it.
going to cost you more.
And your consequence is related to what that is. Whereas now, like, there's not set consequences, and you hear stories about this over and over again, where someone will do absolutely something terrible and they get like 2 months in jail, or they get only probation or whatever it is, and everyone's like, there's no justice. And you're right, there's not there, and it's an awful system at times, but
even still though, if we were Hebrews living in the time period of Joshua and you killed my favorite cow, and I loved this cow, and I fed it, and I named it, and I sang to it, and it moved back to me, and we were best buds, and you killed it. If you just give me another cow,
it's not the same.
It's not.
No,
it's that's not
no,
just.
it's not.
And if you can never get justice for someone who has been murdered, you can't do it. Like it can't be done. And I think that's a tension that we read in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that's why there is this emphasis that life doesn't end here. That there will be a new heavens and a new earth, a new creation where we can be with God, and we will finally have justice, real justice, and things will look different than they do now. So there is that element in the Bible too, where it's like you can't really have perfect justice here.
Yeah, and it talks about that a little bit in Amos 5 verse 24, where it talks about let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream. And I like the analogy it uses there, where it talks about it like a river, because it is something that's like flowing and changing, and kind of through time it's going to do that. But I just think it's a good analogy, especially with what you said there too, where justice isn't necessarily something that is just set, but it's something that does change, and especially God shows you through the Bible, case by case by case. It can be the same case, but he'll have different mercy or different justice at times. Which can be confusing.
Like right now, we're just we're triaging right now. Like we're dealing with problems the best that we can in our human way. But there is going to be a day of reckoning. There is going to be something that's going to be different, and God is going to restore. I really think joy and peace, and so I think a lot of the things that we scream over now in this life over justice won't matter in the next life, because God will literally be fulfilling our purpose. So,
okay. Is it okay to push our own ideas of justice? This one's a little bit, can get a little tricky. For example, protesting sit-ins or marches, or a good example would be like sitting in front of an abortion clinic and that kind of thing. Is that kind of pushing of justice, of our own justice, our own version, our own beliefs? Where do you guys think
it depends.
That comes into play?
I think it depends is like the basic answer. Like we have to go with that because it is such a case by case thing.
Okay.
Right? And I think like me personally with like abortion clinics and those kinds of things, am I going to stand out there, yell at them, tell them that they're murdering their children, hold up photos of what it looks like with big signs and a microphone? Personally, I'm probably never going to do that. Does that mean that kind of thing has never ever worked? No, it doesn't. It has worked before.
Right.
But is it a form of justice? Is it a justice we should be fighting for? I think it's a great question, and I think
I guess
it depends.
The question could be, how should we fight for justice when we?
Right.
Because not all of our laws agree with our moral compass, right? And and you've got people on both sides of that. And everywhere in between. So how should we, if we feel that there is something that is unjust, fight for justice, especially if we can't ultimately get justice in this life?
And I mean, we do have a responsibility as Christians to stand up for the morality of God. We absolutely do, no question about it. But the question really is in how you do that. And again, it has to depend. It depends on who you are. It depends on what the injustice is that you're standing against. And, God says, Jesus Christ said that everything you do, it's a teaching in the New Testament that everything you do be seasoned with grace. And Jesus' golden rules: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So, that classic saying that your mom should teach you when you're a kid: put yourself in the other person's shoes. What would work for you? And I think that's why Christians have, like, God doesn't strip you of your personality when you become a Christian. He just enhances you, and he makes you more of what you were supposed to be.
Yeah.
Because every different personality can resonate with someone else who's not saved, who has that same personality.
Right.
So what's going to work for you is not going to work for me, is not going to work for
Right.
you. It's all
Right.
different.
It can be different.
And so we have to witness to the world according to our convictions and according to what God has put in us. And sometimes it will make us really uncomfortable. So I'm not saying just do what makes you comfortable as a Christian. That's not what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But I think there are different forms of standing up for justice depending on who you are as a Christian. And as long as you're loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself, and your neighbor includes the person that you're trying to stop from committing the injustice, and includes the person who has committed the injustice as well. So it's a complicated question, I think.
Yeah.
To say the least.
It is a complicated question.
Yep, that was intentional.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. If we are not bound anymore by the Old Testament law, does that make it void or outdated? I like asking these questions.
It depends on what you mean
Switch
by.
roles next time.
It depends on what you mean by void and outdated, because I think some of the cultural elements are outdated. Don't stone me. Hold on. In terms of that, I think all of the morality definitely applies.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus himself said, "Not until all things are accomplished, not one jot or tittle will pass from the law."
Right.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
So, but Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of that law for us. He fulfilled it because no one can live it. And even Paul, the apostle himself, it's all over the place, Romans, Galatians. You know, he was a Jew of Jews, he called himself.
Yeah.
He was a Pharisee or a rabbi. He fulfilled the law. That's why he felt justified to kill Christians.
Kill the Christians, yeah.
But he admits, he's like, even we as Jews know that none of us can perfectly fulfill the law, which is why there was sacrifices.
Right.
And they depended on the mercy of God. So I've gone on a branch here, but
It's a good branch.
but I think that for the most part, as Christians, luckily we just have to follow Jesus Christ, and he worries about fulfilling the law
Praise God.
for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't have to offer sacrifices. We don't have to follow all of the cultural laws or the cleanliness laws or the food laws.
Right.
We don't have to do it. And we see that modeled for us. Anyone who could be like, oh, but Corie, pig isn't healthy for you. Okay, sure, it might not be. But in Acts chapter 11 and chapter 15, just to name a couple of them, the New Testament church dealt with this very issue.
Yep.
Yeah.
Do Gentiles have to become Jews, meaning following the Mosaic law, in order to follow Christ? And the answer is no.
No, we don't.
No.
Yeah.
And in fact, you see Peter and Paul living as Gentiles, which means eating as Gentiles and things like that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything else.
Which I think is such a blessing that God and the Holy Spirit chose to put that in the Bible, because I think it would be a never-ending debate if they didn't.
Yes.
And I'm very thankful for those chapters and verses that it's there. But yeah, to say that it's outdated is sort of like almost like a cliche, catchy term that everyone uses when they're like, I don't have to follow the Bible, it's outdated. So it's sort of one of those phrases that I'm like,
That's true.
let's not get too close to this.
That's
Right.
true.
But at the same time, to say that that's not our base for morality and that you shouldn't still read the old law and not like maybe
There's
go ahead and
so
memorize it
much
if you want to,
value.
but there's
Yeah.
so much value in it. And it's so much that when you have that view of the old law and the extreme justice that is there in those laws,
Right.
you then, through the scriptures, get painted this amazing, gorgeous picture of
do.
God's mercy. And I think without those laws and without those rules and without the justice, you just don't get that. And you just don't get the full gospel without it.
Right.
So to say that it's outdated and void and all those kinds of things, no, I don't think it is. But I
Yes.
do think very much what Corie was saying, that do we follow it? No. And God specifically does talk about that in Acts.
Yeah.
And thank goodness he does. And how amazing then does that complete the story that these sacrifices, we don't have to give them anymore because Jesus
Yeah.
paid that for us.
Yeah.
And we can just be so thankful for that, you know, regardless of the justice systems and those kinds of things that we do have, you know, God's mercy is still there and so
Yeah.
evident. And that's so what this whole gospel story message is about.
Yeah.
Is
Right.
God's mercy, his love, and how we don't have to do that anymore because Jesus has fulfilled it, which is awesome.
Yeah. Which relates to justice as well, in the fact that as Christians today, we have to be careful not to screw up our sense of justice by only looking at the New Testament, because there's also a New Testament, and the Gospels happened, and Jesus is there.
Yeah.
So Jesus does change the effect of the Mosaic Law.
And that's what the Pharisees were trying to do.
Yes.
The Pharisees would go up with this adultering woman and be like, "Ha, Jesus, we gotcha. You got to stone her now." And Jesus is like, "No," and he doesn't follow the law
and
there.
then he dies for her.
Yeah.
That's like, it's amazing.
But the Pharisees I can't even imagine how mad they would have been that Jesus chose that response, because they were like, it was a gotcha situation.
Yeah.
They thought they had him. And for Jesus to choose mercy there is just such a testament about what we can do in those kinds of situations as well. We can choose mercy there.
Yeah.
God gave
If
us
God
that
himself
option now.
chooses it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
How much more should we?
He opened that door.
And this is one of those instances too that the Pharisees were like, "Oh man, he's claiming to be God, because only God can show mercy in the face of the law."
Yeah.
They knew that. Everyone knew that. So again, this is one of those ways that Jesus claimed his divinity,
Which is so cool.
and inevitably got him killed.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Cool.
Okay, that wraps up all of my questions. Do you guys have anything you want to add?
No, I think that's it for
no,
me.
just keeping Jesus in our center of justice.
Yeah.
I think is really important.
It's so key.
It's
Yeah.
very
So key.
It is,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Great.
Well, thank you for joining us on the table. You can find more of our videos on Facebook or YouTube, and check out BibleDiscoveryTV.com, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for joining the discussion we've thrown on the table today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, you can give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest content from Bible Discovery TV. You can also find On the Table on Facebook with our latest episodes and some bonus content.